Suffering Part 2. Growth Through Suffering Chapter 4. Suffering reveals your true personality, the hidden gems of courage, fidelity, and heroism. Confucius, the wise man from China, said the gem cannot be polished without friction, nor man can be perfected without tears. And Swami Shivananda, life is a school in which every sorrow, every pain, every heartbreak brings a precious lesson. It is through sacrifice, asceticism, a person improves his nerves, his will, his stomach, even his figure. Indeed, the great beauty of life is to be seen only through tears. Even physical imperfection can turn into a motivation to success. We meet women and men of every walk of life with handicaps which fail to slow them in their struggle to achieve and live up to their ideals. Lord Byron had a club foot, Robert L. Stevenson had tuberculosis, Alexander Pope was a hunchback, Admiral Nelson had only one eye, Edgar Poe was a psychoneurotic, Julius Caesar was an epileptic, Thomas Edison was deaf, Oscar Wilde, who had his share of woes, could write. Suffering is really a revelation. One discerns things one never discerned before. One approaches the whole of history from a different standpoint. What one had felt dimly through instinct about art is intellectually and emotionally realized with perfect clearness of vision and absolute intensity of appreciation. Overcome suffering. Joan Hudson, in her book A Hunger for Wholeness, admits that fear of suffering is always around me like a hand cupping a flame from a treacherous wind. She addresses fear thus: fear of suffering, how many agonizing moments of anxiety you have unnecessarily laid on my enslaved heart. How many sunrises I could not welcome because you held me sleepless in your inexorable grip all night. How many resplendent sunsets I never even noticed because you had my sight colored with the dye of fright. How many voices called to me that I never heard because the tirade of your fright evoking words eclipsed all other sounds. How often you made me stand shivering on the shores of life while others fearlessly and joyously dipped into the sea of life. If I really believe that God tempers the wind to the shorn lamb, I won't fastidiously measure the velocity of the headwinds. If I really believe His words, behold, I am always with you. I won't fear loneliness. If I really believe His words, come to me and I will give you rest, I won't fear having no one to turn to. If I really believe His word, peace I give you, I will believe that there is for me an inward stillness that all the sounds of the wildly pulsating world cannot shatter. Take the risk. Life, with all its activity, implies risk. It cannot offer success in all attempts. There is always a hair's breadth between failure and success, but the danger is part of the thrill. Reflect on the joke. Mother, I have tried so hard to make you a good child, Baji, and yet, in spite of all my efforts, you are still rude and naughty. Baji, deeply moved. What a failure you are, mother. We cannot expect success all the time. There are ups and downs. We may fail and therefore suffer, also because we are weak and at times inconsistent. We fail to do and fail to be. In her book, Gateway to Hope, M. Boulding writes that learning to deal with failure is part of life, a necessary part for those who aspire to be human. This is already obvious in everyday experience before we attempt to plumb the depths of meaning that failure can disclose in our life with God. If you are learning to speak a new language, you must sooner or later open your mouth and risk making a fool of yourself. It may be that gales of laughter will greet your remarks, but the hearers, when they recover, may point out your mistakes and you will have learned something. Some failures act as a challenge, stimulating a person's aggressive instincts. We want to pick ourselves up again, fight back, try harder, direct our effort a little differently, and win next time. Do your best and leave the rest to God. Vain regrets are a waste of time and psychological energies. Do not neglect to educate yourself to find out suffering, meaning, and message. This education helps you to discover all that is positive and beautiful in you. J. Goldbrunner writes that our bodies are subject to the birth and development that allows us no rest. They drive us irresistibly forward from birth to death. Through our bodies, we are the slaves of a current that bears us past many shores. After a short stay, we have to leave each of them. We are driven forward by biological factors independent of the spiritual person. The child becomes a girl, then a mother, and an old woman. We grow up, flourish, reach a climax, and then decline towards old age and finally death. So, this life process confronts us with a great problem, the problem of maturing. The biological process forces us on from stage to stage, but the tendency of the spirit is against leaving the old to receive the new. Don't resign to disappointment. A little boy was leading his sister up a mountain path. Why? She complained. It's not a path, it's all rocky and bumpy. Sure, he said, the bumps are what you climb on. Do not resign to suffering, disappointments, and make failure or suffering a stepping stone to success. Take courage from the poet's words. Sometimes we may fail in our aim. Some sighs and regrets may arise, but by striving and playing the game, we'll find where true happiness lies. Self pity will either make suffering intolerable to us by revolt and despair, or else, thanks to faith and hope in God, it will make a redemptive power. The success and happiness lies in admitting and accepting the suffering as part of our life and by gaining by our experience. The new. The spiritual development does not always keep pace with the biological course of life. An unknown author writes, a successful man is one who has tried, not cried, who has worked, not dodged, who has shouldered responsibility, not evaded it, who has gotten under the burden, not merely stood off looking on, giving advice and philosophizing on the situation. The tree that never had to fight the sun, air, and light and stood out in the open plain always got his share of rain, never became a forest king, and lived and died a scrubby thing. The man who never had to toil, who never had to win his share of sun and sky and light and air, never became a manly man but lived and died as he began. Grow Through Grief, Chapter 5. The information available on the psychology of grief is still minimal. Sure enough, grief is a universal experience of deep pain. Often it is a traumatic crisis for the bereaved person, namely widows and widowers. The death of a dear one often results in the total disruption of one's life. It can lead the bereaved persons to lose their sense of direction and connection to the outside world. Stanley M. Grabowski writes that bereaved individuals often find difficulty accepting the death of a spouse. The spouse's presence seems to persist in many ways. Sometimes it is manifest in dreams, sometimes in daytime visions, and at other times the expectation that deceased spouse will be returning shortly. Older people in a state of psychological stress brought on by the death of a spouse run a higher risk of neglecting their health. Accept the death. Death is a natural process of our life, and since we all have a date with death, let us so live that we are always ready to keep it. Accept that the end of your earthly journey, it is but the doorway to that life beyond the grave. Poet Rabindranath Tagore sings, death is not extinguishing the light, it is putting out the lamp because the dawn has come. A veteran nurse of a big hospital in the city tells of her experience. It has always seemed to me a major tragedy that so many people go through life haunted by the fear of death, only to find when it comes that it's as natural as life itself. For very few are afraid to die when they get to the very end. In all my experience, only one seemed to feel any terror, a woman who had done her sister wrong, which was too late to right. Something strange and beautiful happens to men and women when they come to the end of the road. All fear disappears. I have often watched a look of happy wonder dawn in their eyes when they realize this was true. It is all part of the goodness of nature, and I believe of the illimitable goodness of God. Accept your grief. Grief is God given and has the express function of healing the pain and the hurt of human loss. Sometimes people are so guilty about having feelings of grief that they neither ignore them or suppress them. This can be very damaging, for grief feelings are normal and necessary. We cannot escape our losses by merely ignoring them or turning our minds to other things. Peace and quiet have an important part to play in the grief process, but no amount of thinking and intellectualizing can end feelings. It is wise to allow ourselves to grieve and sometimes to cry, for crying has a great power to soothe and to heal. By acknowledging our feelings and accepting them through the integration of the past into the present, we can move ahead towards adjustment and normalcy. If the feelings of loss is great, it is beneficial to talk about it to a sympathetic listener who appreciates that the need is understanding. Dr. Grager Westberg notes 10 stages of grief through which people move as they grieve. These stages are not always clearly discernible, nor do they always follow this order. First, we are in a state of shock which may last for a few moments to a few weeks. Second, we express emotion. Third, we feel deeply distressed and very lonely. Fourth, we experience a physical symptoms which are related to mental distress. Fifth, panic sets in when we find ourselves unable to get our minds off the subject of our loss. Sixth, we experience a sense of guilt about the loss, both normal and neurotic. Seventh, we are filled with hostility and resentment. Eighth, we are unable to return to usual activities. Ninth, gradually hope comes through as we accept new opportunities for meaningful living. And tenth, through the struggle, we come out as different people. The mature person will realize he has not lost everything. He still has God on whom he relies, and eventually gets back into the mainstream of life. Be a friend to the one who grieves. Healing from grief is ultimately a choice of will, and sometimes it takes an understanding but courageous friend to help the bereaved face that truth. Don't yield to the temptation to stay at a distance when death visits the house of your friend. It is not an easy task to be there. You may not know how to act or what to say to a grieving friend, but remember that your presence is very helpful. Your friend needs to know that you are there for him. Just be a good listener. Curb your impulse to interrupt your friend if he feels like talking. The Pulse magazine, edited by Vincent, gives some hints on how to comfort a grieving friend. Time your visits carefully. Telephone or visit when it's best for the bereaved to talk, but not just when it's convenient for you. Your first visit needn't be, in fact, it shouldn't be lengthy. Stay long enough to drop off a cake or to chat for a few minutes. Expect a moodiness, character changes, even anger. Grief is a time of emotional upheaval. Allow the bereaved to talk about the loss. Telling the story helps the bereaved person to believe it, thus beginning the healing process. Reach out, embrace your friend, hugs, transfer energy, so share your strength. Those who grieve often long to be touched, and it's a wise longing because the human touch heals. Don't withdraw support too quickly, especially when a friend has lost a child. There will still be many painful days to get through well into the second year. Offer to run errands, babysit, provide transportation, meals, and so forth. Little things really do mean a lot. Holidays can be painful reminders the way things were. It might help if you were to suggest that your friend do something for someone else in honor of the loved one. A sudden absence of invitations is also hurtful. Be creative but don't forget your friend. Comforting the dying. Roberta Messner, who was a nurse, has experience with the dying and cares for them, gives some practical pointers to offer hope, comfort, and strength. Take an active role. Sometimes this means being a receiver as well as a giver. Give the patient an active role. The dying person has given up all many aspects of life. You can help by giving back some control. Be aware of denial. People who are dying often avoid facing the obvious fact. This is called denial. It is a phase that often comes and goes. At one moment, one of my patients discussed his cancer freely. At another, he blamed his pains on a momentary flare up of arthritis. Denial can be protective, sometimes necessary, crucial for the dying person. If the patient wants to talk about that, then do so, but take your cues from him. Be attuned to the spiritual concerns. Pursue the patient's own spiritual needs, not yours. If the person wants to pray, listen to specific concerns. Then construct a prayer rephrasing those very words. Be realistic. Refrain from platitudes such as everything will be okay. Let the person verbalize his or her feelings. Be hopeful. Even in dying, there is always a reason for hope. And finally, on all occasions, remember the words of Victor Hugo. Have courage for the great sorrow of life and patience for the small ones. And when you have laboriously accomplished your daily task, go to sleep in peace. God is awake.